The room was silent. Not the calm kind of silence, but the kind that presses against your chest like something is about to break. Screens glowed across the war room, maps of the Strait of Hormuz flickering with red and yellow markers, oil tankers, warships, dead zones, the world's most dangerous bottleneck where nearly 20% of global oil flows was no longer just a trade route. It had become a weapon. Business standard. And I had warned them. For 10 years, I had said the same thing. Iran would never give up control of Hormuz, not willingly, not under pressure, not even under war. They laughed at first. Analysts called it outdated thinking. Politicians dismissed it as fear-mongering. Even allies rolled their eyes when I said one simple line, Hormuz is not geography, it's leverage. But now, ships were turning back. Entire fleets just stopping. Oil prices were swinging violently. Markets were bleeding, then recovering, then collapsing again within hours. It wasn't chaos, it was control. And behind that control was a partnership no one fully understood. China. For years, Beijing had quietly built something far more dangerous than a military alliance. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It didn't come with headlines. It came with contracts, oil deals, infrastructure, silent naval drills. Iran International, while the West argued, China invested. While sanctions tightened, China adapted. While others tried to isolate Iran, China integrated it. And now the result was unfolding in real time. Satellite feeds showed something strange. Ships were being allowed through, but only certain ones. Routes weren't closed. They were curated, controlled, designed. It wasn't a blockade. It was a filter. A senior analyst leaned over my shoulder and whispered, "Sir, these ships, most of them are tied to Chinese trade routes." I didn't respond immediately, because I already knew. The first signal came at 03:17 a.m. A tanker flagged under a neutral registry entered Hormuz. Standard procedure, clearance expected. Instead, it was stopped. No attack, no explosion, just a message. Turn back. Minutes later, another vessel linked to a Chinese energy firm entered the same waters. It passed. No resistance, no delay, no warning. That's when the room changed. People stopped talking. Fingers froze over keyboards. Eyes locked onto screens as the pattern repeated again and again and again. This wasn't random. This was policy. Within hours, global shipping networks began rerouting. Insurance companies raised risk levels. Energy markets reacted instantly. Oil dropped, then surged again as uncertainty spread. Market watch. And then came the confirmation. Intercepted communications. Short, direct, unmistakable. Iranian command had placed Hormuz under controlled access. Business Insider, not closed, controlled. That word changed everything, because it meant what I had been saying for a decade was true. Iran didn't need to shut Hormuz to win. It just needed to decide who gets through. And China? China had made sure it would always be on the list. Years of energy dependence had tied Beijing directly to the Gulf. China wasn't just a buyer. It was the backbone of Iran's economic survival. Iran international oil kept flowing, but selectively. And in that moment, the global order shifted. The United States had ships in the region, powerful ones, dominant ones. But power doesn't always win against control, because control doesn't need to destroy. It just needs to decide. And in just 24 hours, the proof was undeniable. By the second day, the illusion was gone. Diplomats scrambled. Emergency meetings filled calendars. Statements were released, carefully worded, strategically vague. Iran has reopened the strait. The situation is stabilizing. Global supply chains remain intact. But behind the words, the truth was far more dangerous. Hormuz wasn't open, it was conditional. Even when Iran publicly claimed the strait was open, only limited ships moved, and many were turned away unexpectedly. Business Insider. The world wasn't witnessing a crisis, it was witnessing a demonstration, a message. And that message was simple. The era of uncontested global trade routes is over. China had spent a decade preparing for this moment, not by building bases everywhere, but by securing dependence, energy dependence, trade dependence, strategic dependence. While others focused on dominance, China focused on inevitability. And Iran became the gatekeeper. Together, they didn't need to fight the system. They rewrote it. In the war room, someone finally broke the silence. So what do we do now? I looked at the map again, the narrow strip of water that controlled the fate of economies, governments, entire nations, and I said the only honest thing left to say, we adapt, or we fall behind. Because this wasn't about a strait anymore. It was about a new world, one where power isn't measured by how much force you can project, but by how precisely you can control the flow of everything that matters. And in just 24 hours, they proved it. The third day didn't begin with explosions. It began with silence. A different kind this time. Not fear, but calculation. Washington didn't react publicly. No dramatic speeches, no immediate show of force. That alone was enough to unsettle everyone watching. Because when power stays quiet, it usually means it's thinking. Inside classified rooms, decisions were being weighed that would never reach headlines. Direct confrontation? Too risky? Economic retaliation? Too slow? Cyber disruption? Too uncertain? Because this wasn't a battlefield you could bomb your way out of. Iran hadn't fired a missile. China hadn't deployed a fleet. They had done something far more difficult to counter. They had stayed within the lines while bending the rules. Shipping lanes were technically open. No official blockade. No violation that could trigger a clean military response. And that was the genius of it. By the fourth hour of internal briefings, a realization spread across the room like a slow-moving storm. This wasn't an attack. It was a system test. And the system had failed. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, something else was happening. Quietly, efficiently, almost invisibly. Alternative routes were activating. Pipelines long dismissed as redundant suddenly carried weight. Rail corridors stretching across continents once seen as ambitious projects became lifelines. Ports in distant regions lit up with unexpected activity. And at the center of it all, China. For years, Beijing had built a network designed for exactly this moment, a web of routes, agreements, and contingencies that didn't rely entirely on Hormuz. While the rest of the world panicked, China adjusted, not perfectly, but enough. Back in the war room, one analyst finally said what no one wanted to admit. They're not just controlling the choke point, they're controlling the alternatives too. That's when it became clear. This wasn't about a single strait. It was about control over the entire map. By the end of the week, cracks began to show. Not in ships, not in fleets, but in alliances. Countries that once spoke with unified voices started choosing words more carefully. Some called for restraint, others called for negotiation. A few, quietly, started making calls behind closed doors. Because when survival is on the line, principles become flexible. Energy-hungry nations faced a brutal reality: wait for stability or secure their own access. And access now came with conditions: new contracts, new terms, new dependencies. Iran didn't need to demand loyalty. It only needed to offer passage. China didn't need to pressure anyone. It simply provided solutions. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifted. Markets stabilized, but not because the crisis ended. They stabilized because they adapted to the new normal. A controlled flow, a selective system, a world where access wasn't guaranteed, it was negotiated. In intelligence briefings, a new phrase began appearing: fragmented global order. It sounded academic, harmless even, but in reality it meant something far more dangerous. The world was no longer playing by one set of rules. It was splitting into spheres. On one side, nations still trying to preserve open systems. On the other, nations learning to operate within controlled ones. And in between, uncertainty, the most dangerous place of all. Back in the command center, a younger officer, new, sharp, still holding on to old assumptions, asked a question that cut through the noise. Why didn't we see this coming? No one answered immediately, because the truth wasn't easy to say. It wasn't that they didn't see it, it was that they didn't believe it would actually happen. Weeks passed. No war, no dramatic escalation. No headline moment that would mark the crisis as over, because it never really ended. It evolved. Ships continued to pass through Hormuz, but now under an invisible layer of permission. Insurance premiums stayed high. Shipping companies adjusted routes. Governments revised strategies. And the world moved on, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had changed. Power was no longer about who could shut things down. It was about who could keep things running on their terms. Iran had proven it could control without closing. China had proven it could secure influence without confrontation. And together, they had demonstrated a model that others would study and eventually try to replicate. In quiet strategy rooms across the globe, maps were being redrawn, not physically, but conceptually. Choke points, trade routes, supply chains, everything was being reevaluated through a new lens. Who controls access? Because in this new era, access was everything. Not just to oil, but to trade, to resources, to stability itself. And as I stood once again in front of that same glowing map, the one that had started it all, I realized something that sent a chill deeper than any crisis ever had. This wasn't the peak. It was the preview. The first real demonstration of a world where control replaces dominance, where influence replaces force, where systems become weapons. And if this could happen in 24 hours, what could happen next time? I didn't say it out loud. I didn't need to. Because everyone in that room was already thinking the same thing. The rules hadn't just changed, they had been rewritten. The breaking point didn't come from Iran or China. It came from a mistake. At 02:46 a.m., a mid-sized tanker, Panamanian flag, privately owned, entered the outer corridor of the strait. It had clearance, verified, logged, approved, and yet it was intercepted. Not redirected, not warned, intercepted. Within minutes, conflicting signals flooded the system. Iranian patrol boats moved in. The tanker's captain transmitted distress codes. Then, unexpectedly, a third player appeared on radar. A military vessel, not American, not Iranian, unmarked. That's when everything spiraled. Command centers across the world lit up simultaneously. Analysts scrambled to identify the vessel. Communications overlapped. Orders were issued, then reversed, then issued again. Because in that moment, no one was fully in control. The unmarked vessel held position, just long enough to create confusion, then vanished from radar. Gone, like it had never existed. But the damage was done. The tanker shut down engines. Iranian forces escalated posture. Nearby fleets adjusted positions. And within minutes, global alerts triggered the phrase everyone feared, potential multi-party engagement, which was just a polite way of saying, this could turn into war. Back in the war room, tension snapped tight. This wasn't calculated anymore. This wasn't controlled. This was unpredictable. And unpredictability is what starts wars. A senior commander finally spoke, voice steady but edged with urgency. If this escalates, we don't control the outcome. No one disagreed, because for the first time since the crisis began, control was slipping. The truth didn't come through official channels. It came through fragments, a satellite anomaly, a broken signal pattern, a piece of intelligence that didn't fit until it did. The unmarked vessel wasn't a mistake. It was a probe, not by Iran, not by China, but by a third force, one that had been watching everything unfold, waiting for the right moment. A nation powerful enough to influence, but cautious enough to remain invisible. They weren't trying to start a war. They were testing something else entirely. how fragile the system had become. And the answer came faster than anyone expected. Very fragile. Within hours of the incident, markets reacted violently. Oil spiked, shipping halted temporarily. Insurance rates surged again. Governments issued urgent advisories, all triggered by a single controlled disruption. That's when the realization hit, harder than anything before it. If one unidentified actor could shake the system this much, then the system wasn't stable at all. It was balanced on a knife's edge. Back-channel communications exploded into action, quiet calls between capitals, urgent reassurances, silent warnings, because now it wasn't just about Iran controlling Hormuz or China securing its interests. It was about the possibility that others could exploit it, and that changed everything. Because once a system is proven vulnerable, it doesn't stay controlled for long. The crisis didn't end with a battle. It ended with understanding. Within 48 hours of the incident, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Iran adjusted its posture. China increased coordination. Global powers stepped back, not out of weakness, but out of recognition. Because pushing further wouldn't restore the old system, it would destroy what remained of it. The Strait of Hormuz stayed open, controlled, conditional, but stable enough to prevent collapse. And that was enough, for now. In the final briefing, the room felt different. Not tense, not chaotic, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after you realize something irreversible has happened. The map still glowed, the ship still moved, the world still functioned. But underneath it all, the foundation had changed. I looked at the same narrow strip of water that had triggered everything and understood what most people still didn't. This wasn't about Iran proving strength, or China proving strategy, or even about global power shifting. It was about something deeper, something far more permanent. Control had replaced certainty. The world no longer operated on guaranteed access, predictable systems, or stable rules. Everything was now conditional, negotiated, fragile, and that meant one thing above all. The next crisis wouldn't need a war to shake the world. It would only need a signal, a pause, a decision, because in this new era, power doesn't announce itself with explosions. It reveals itself in moments like this one, where in just 24 hours, the world learned that the most powerful weapon isn't force, it's control over what everyone else depends on.